In 1924, a farm wife in rural Ohio fed her family through an entire winter without a single working icebox. Her cellar held enough food to last until April, and not one jar spoiled. Today, we panic if the power flickers for 6 hours. Number 14 on this list sat in the backyard of nearly every farmhouse in America, yet almost nobody alive can explain how it actually worked. And number 3 started a revolution that food companies spent decades quietly trying to take credit for. These 25 methods kept a whole nation fed long before electricity ever reached the countryside. Hit that subscribe button, because what your grandparents knew might matter a lot more than you think. Let us count down the 25 forgotten ways our grandparents preserved food without a refrigerator. Number 25. Leather breeches beans. Before frozen vegetables filled every grocery aisle, mountain families in Appalachia preserved their green beans by drying them whole on a string. After the summer harvest came in heavier than anyone could eat, your great-grandmother would thread a sewing needle with strong cotton thread and run it straight through the middle of each fresh bean pod and all. She hung those long strands behind the wood stove or across the porch rafters where the air moved, and over a few weeks, the beans shriveled and turned a dull brown, leather color. That is where the name came from. They looked like little strips of hide. Come January, she dropped a double handful into a pot with a piece of fat back and simmered them for hours until they swelled back to life, chewy and smoky and nothing like a fresh bean. A whole summer's worth cost nothing but thread and patience. Families in Tennessee and Kentucky ate leather breeches all winter when the garden was buried under snow. Number 24. Apples wrapped in newspaper. A good apple harvest could rot in a week if you just piled it in a basket, because one bad apple really does spoil the bunch. So your grandparents wrapped each apple individually in a single sheet of newspaper, twisting the ends like a piece of candy, and laid them in a single layer in a wooden crate. The paper kept the apples from touching, which stopped the rot from spreading, and it blocked just enough light and air to slow everything down. Stored in a cool cellar or a back bedroom that never got heat, wrapped apples kept crisp and sweet from October clear into March. You picked the firmest, most perfect apples for this. Bruised ones went straight into the apple butter pot. A bushel cost almost nothing if you had a tree, and that one tree in the side yard could feed a family pie after pie through the whole dark half of the year. Number 23. Braided onions and garlic. Walk into any farm kitchen before the war and you would see ropes of onions and garlic hanging from a nail by the door. And that was not decoration. After pulling the crop, your grandmother let the onions dry in the sun for a week until the outer skins turned papery and the tops went limp. Then she braided the dried tops together into long plaits, sometimes 3 feet long, and hung them in a cool, dry, airy spot. Hanging them did 2 things. It kept air circulating around every single bulb so moisture never collected and started rot, and it kept them up off the floor away from mice. A well-braided rope of onions lasted 6 months or more, and you just snapped one off the bottom whenever supper called for it. Garlic kept even longer. For families who ran their whole kitchen on onions and pork fat, this simple braid was the difference between flavor all winter and a bland, hungry February. Number 22. Dried sweet corn. Fresh corn season lasted maybe 3 weeks, but a clever woman could stretch it across the entire year. After cutting the kernels off the cob, your great-grandmother spread them thin on clean cloths or screens and set them out in the August sun, stirring them every few hours so they dried evenly. Some families dried it slow, in a barely warm oven instead. The kernels shrank to hard little amber pebbles, and in that state they kept for a year or more in a cloth sack. To bring it back, she soaked the dried corn overnight, then simmered it low with butter and a little milk until it plumped up sweet and chewy with a deep, almost caramelized flavor that fresh corn never had. They called it leather corn in some places. It tasted like summer in the middle of a snowstorm, and a single afternoon of drying could put up enough to last until the next crop came in. Number 21. Root vegetables packed in sand. Carrots, beets, parsnips, and turnips will go soft and rubbery in a matter of weeks if you just leave them sitting out. So your grandparents kept them buried in damp sand. They lined a wooden box or a barrel with a layer of slightly moist sand, laid the vegetables in so none of them touched each other, then poured more sand over the top and repeated it layer after layer until the box was full. The sand held just enough moisture to keep the vegetables from shriveling, but not enough to rot them, and it blocked the light that would have made them sprout. Stored in a cold cellar, carrots packed this way stayed crisp and snapping fresh from the fall harvest until the following spring. You just dug down with your hand and pulled out whatever you needed for dinner. No grocery store carrot, trucked 1,000 miles and wax shiny, has ever tasted as alive as one pulled out of the sand in February. Number 20. Sulfured dried apples. Plain dried apples turn brown and tough, but our grandparents had a trick to keep them pale, soft, and almost fresh tasting for a year or more. After peeling and slicing the apples into rings, they set them on racks inside a closed box or barrel and burned a small dish of sulfur underneath. The fumes settled over the fruit as it dried, and that sulfur kept the color light and the texture tender while stopping mold dead. The dried rings strung up on thread and hung from the kitchen ceiling where they swayed in the heat all winter. Stewed with a little sugar and cinnamon, they plumped back up into something close to fresh fruit, and they were the secret filling in 1,000 fried apple pies sold at church suppers across the South. A bushel of windfall apples nobody else wanted became a year of dessert, and the only cost was a few cents of sulfur from the general store. Number 19. Eggs in water glass. Hens lay like crazy in spring and summer, then nearly quit in the cold months, so the problem was always how to save the spring eggs for the lean winter. The answer was water glass, which was just sodium silicate, sold cheap at any drugstore or feed store. Your grandmother mixed it with boiled, cooled water in a big stoneware crock, then gently lowered in clean, unwashed, fresh-laid eggs, one at a time. The thick liquid sealed every pore in the shell, locking out the air and bacteria that spoil an egg, and down in a cool cellar, those eggs stayed good for 8 months or longer. When she needed one, she reached down into the slippery crock, pulled out an egg, rinsed it, and used it for baking or frying like it was laid that morning. A single crock could hold 100 eggs put up in May, ready and waiting all the way through the following winter. People who try it today are stunned that it works at all. Here is where it gets interesting. Everything on this list so far came down to one quiet, relentless idea that has almost completely vanished from American life. You did not throw food away, and you did not assume the store would always be there. The harvest came in all at once, in a flood, and then for 8 or 9 months nothing grew at all. The entire rhythm of a household was built around capturing that flood and making it last. Your great-grandmother was not following a hobby. She was running a private food supply chain with no electricity, no freezer, and no second chances. And if she got it wrong, her family went hungry. Every braided onion and every crock of eggs was a small bet against starvation. We forgot all of it the moment a refrigerator hummed in the corner and a supermarket opened down the road. We did not just lose the recipes, we lost the entire way of thinking that made them necessary. Number 18. The spring house. Long before electric refrigeration, families lucky enough to have a cold spring on their land built a small stone house right over the running water. The spring bubbled up cold out of the ground, usually around 50 degrees year-round, and flowed through a shallow stone trough inside the little building. Your great-grandmother set crocks of milk, butter, and cream right down into that cold water, and the constant flow carried the heat away and kept everything chilled. The thick stone walls held the cool in and the summer sun out. Milk that would have soured by noon on the counter stayed fresh for days in the spring house. Butter firmed up hard. It was the closest thing to a refrigerator that most of rural America had, and it cost nothing to run because the spring did all the work for free, day and night, forever. Some of those old stone spring houses still stand in the hills, cold inside on the hottest day of summer. Number 17. Lowering crocks down the well. Not every family had a spring, but nearly everyone had a well, and a well was a cold, dark hole going straight down into the cool earth. So your grandparents put it to double duty. They tied a rope around the neck of a crock or a tin pail, sealed it tight, and lowered it down into the well shaft to hang just above the water line where the air stayed cold and damp all summer long. Butter, milk, leftover meat, a watermelon for Sunday dinner, all of it went down the well to stay cool. When you wanted it, you hauled the rope back up, hand over hand. There was an art to it. Tie the knot wrong and supper went splashing down into the drinking water, which earned you a scolding you would not forget. But done right, the family well kept the milk sweet and the butter firm through July and August without a penny spent on ice. Number 16. The ice house and sawdust. In the dead of winter, men cut huge blocks of ice from frozen ponds and lakes with long saws, hauled them by sled, and packed them into a thick-walled ice house dug partly into the ground. Here is the part that seems impossible. They buried those blocks in sawdust or straw, and that simple insulation kept the ice frozen solid, clear through the heat of summer, sometimes into the following fall. The sawdust trapped pockets of air that slowed the melting to a crawl. Families chipped off chunks to keep the kitchen icebox cold, to make ice cream on the 4th of July, and to chill the milk. A whole community might share one big ice house, every family taking a turn at the winter harvest. It was back-breaking, freezing work done in January, so that you could have a cold glass of buttermilk in August, and for generations, it was the only ice anyone ever knew. Number 15. Pickled eggs in the crock. When the hens were laying their heaviest and the family still had more eggs than it could eat or sell, your grandmother hard-boiled great batches of them and dropped the peeled eggs into a crock of spiced vinegar brine. The vinegar's acid stopped spoilage cold, so the eggs kept for weeks on the pantry shelf with no cold storage at all. Some families tinted them pink and tangy with the juice from a jar of pickled beets. Others spiced the brine sharp with mustard seed, dill, and hot peppers. Down at the corner tavern, a big jar of pickled eggs sat right on the bar next to the pickled pig's feet, a cheap and filling bite for a working man with a nickel in his pocket. At home, they turned up sliced over greens, packed into lunch pails, and eaten straight from the crock as a salty snack. Cheap, sharp, and they lasted nearly forever. Here is something the food companies would rather you never sat and thought about. Almost every method on this list costs next to nothing. Vinegar, salt, sugar, a stone crock, a cold cellar, the running water that was already on your land. There is no brand name on a braid of onions. Nobody can patent a spring house or charge a monthly fee for a hole in the ground full of sawdust. That is exactly why these skills were allowed to disappear. The moment refrigeration arrived, an entire industry grew up to sell you the cold, then sell you the food to put in it, then sell you the food they had already preserved so you would never need to learn how. We were told it was progress, and in a lot of ways it was. But we also handed over something our grandparents owned outright. They controlled their own food, start to finish, and they owed nobody a dime for the privilege. Number 14, Brandied fruit, some of the most prized preserving, did double duty as a treat for grown-ups, and the brandied fruit crock was the finest example. Starting in early summer, your grandmother layered the first ripe fruit, strawberries, then cherries, then peaches and plums, as each came into season, into a big crock with plenty of sugar and a good slug of brandy. Each new fruit got stirred in as the months rolled on, and the alcohol and sugar together preserved everything beautifully without any cold storage. By Christmas, the crock held a boozy, syrupy rainbow of an entire summer's harvest, every fruit drinking up the sweet brandy and giving back its own flavor. Spooned warm over pound cake or vanilla ice cream, it was the kind of dessert that made the holidays feel like abundance. Some families kept a crock going for years, never letting it empty, just adding fruit and sugar and brandy season after season. They called it friendship fruit and passed starters to the neighbors. Number 13, apple butter cooked down all day. Apple butter was not just a spread, it was a preservation method, because cooking the fruit down low and slow for hours with sugar drove out nearly all the water and concentrated it into something that would keep on the shelf for a year. It was an all-day, all-hands affair. The whole family took turns stirring a giant copper kettle of apples and cider over an open fire in the yard, never stopping, because the second you stopped stirring it, scorched on the bottom. Hour after hour, the apples broke down and darkened, the cider boiled away, and the whole farm smelled of cinnamon and cloves and caramelizing sugar. By evening, the kettle held a deep mahogany butter so thick the spoon stood up in it. Ladled hot into crocks and sealed, it lasted the winter on biscuits and bread. A few bushels of cheap windfall apples turned into a year of sweetness, and the work itself became a gathering the neighbors looked forward to. Number 12, the sauerkraut crock. A single head of cabbage spoils in a couple of weeks, but turn it into sauerkraut and it keeps for months, getting better the whole time. Your great-grandparents shredded mountains of fall cabbage fine, packed it into a big stoneware crock with nothing but salt, and pounded it down hard with a wooden tamper until the cabbage released its own juice and the brine rose up to cover it. A plate weighted with a clean rock held everything under the surface away from the air. Then they just waited. Wild bacteria already on the cabbage did the rest, fermenting it slowly into tangy, sour kraut that kept all winter in the cool cellar. The salt and the acid together made it nearly impossible for anything harmful to grow. German and Eastern European families across the Midwest swore by it, and it turns out they were onto something. Modern science now praises that crock of kraut as a powerhouse of probiotics and vitamin C, the very thing that kept scurvy away through a long winter with no fresh greens in sight. Number 11, brine pickles in the crock. Long before pickles came in a jar from the store, every farm kitchen had a crock of cucumbers fermenting in salt water. At the end of cucumber season, your grandmother packed the crock with fresh cucumbers, grape leaves for crispness, garlic, and dill, then covered it all with a strong salt water brine and weighted it down. Over a few weeks, the cucumbers slowly soured into firm, garlicky, mouth-puckering dills, and there they stayed in the cellar, feeding the family for months. This was the same simple chemistry as the kraut. Salt and natural fermentation locked out spoilage and turned a perishable summer vegetable into a food that lasted deep into winter. A barrel of these pickles cost a few cents of cucumbers and a handful of salt, and a single crock could hold enough to put a tangy crunch next to the beans and cornbread at supper night after night until spring finally came back around. Here is the part nobody likes to say out loud. Most of what we now call gourmet, the stuff that shows up on restaurant menus for $14 a plate, was poverty food our grandparents made because they had no other choice. Fermented vegetables, bone broth, cured meats, preserved lemons, brandied fruit. We pay a premium today for the exact techniques that a farm wife in 1930 used because she was broke and the nearest store was a half-day's wagon ride away. The skills did not vanish because they stopped working. They vanished because for 1 or 2 generations, we were embarrassed by them. They smelled like being poor, like the Depression, like doing without. So we threw them out the second we could afford store-bought. And now, slowly, we are paying good money to relearn what we were once ashamed to know. Number 10. Corned beef in the brine barrel. Before the freezer, a whole side of beef was a serious problem because it would spoil long before a family could eat it. So, your great-grandparents corned it. The word corn there is an old term for the coarse grains of salt they used. They submerged the beef in a barrel of heavy saltwater brine, often with saltpeter to keep the color and sugar and pickling spices for flavor, and the salt drew the water out of the meat and made it impossible for spoilage to take hold. Down in the cool cellar, corned beef kept for weeks and even months in that barrel. When dinner called for it, your grandmother fished out a chunk, soaked some of the salt back out, and simmered it slow with cabbage and potatoes until it fell apart tender. It was how a working family stretched expensive beef across a long season, and it built an entire holiday tradition out of pure necessity. Number 9. Potted meat under lard. Here is a method straight out of old Europe that came over to American farm kitchens, and it borders on magic. After cooking meat down until it was meltingly tender, often duck, pork, or sausage, your grandmother packed it tight into a crock and poured melted lard over the top until the meat was completely sealed beneath the fat. As the lard cooled and hardened, it formed an airtight seal that locked the meat away from oxygen entirely. And without air, nothing could spoil. A crock of meat potted this way kept for months in a cool cellar, no refrigeration of any kind. To serve, she spooned out a portion and warmed it, then smoothed the fat back over what remained to keep the seal. The French call this confit and treat it as high cuisine. Our grandparents called it putting up the hog, and they did it every fall at butchering time because wasting a single bite of an animal they had raised all year was simply unthinkable. Number 8. Burying food in a pit. When the cellar was full and the harvest kept coming, families turned to the oldest cold storage of all, the ground itself. They dug a pit in a well-drained spot, lined it with straw, and piled in potatoes, turnips, cabbages, and other hardy root vegetables, then covered the mound with more straw and a thick layer of soil to seal out the frost. They called it a clamp. The earth held the food at a steady cold temperature just above freezing, and the straw kept it from touching the dirt and rotting. A whole winter's worth of potatoes could ride out the deepest cold, buried safe under that mound, and on a January day, you dug into one end, pulled out what you needed, and packed it back up tight. Whole heads of cabbage stored upside down in a pit stayed crisp for months. It was free, it was simple, and it used nothing but a shovel and the cold ground every farm already had. Number 7. The smokehouse. Out behind nearly every farm stood a small windowless building that was the heart of the meat supply, and that was the smokehouse. After the fall hog butchering, your great-grandfather rubbed the hams, shoulders, and bacon with salt to draw out the moisture, then hung them from the rafters over a low, smoldering fire of hickory or applewood. For days, sometimes weeks, that cool smoke drifted up and around the meat, drying it slowly while coating it in compounds that killed bacteria and kept insects away. The salt and the smoke together preserved the pork so thoroughly that a country ham could hang in that smokehouse for a year or more and only get better, growing more concentrated and flavorful with age. A single hog smoked this way fed a family for months. That deep, smoky country ham you pay a fortune for today is the direct descendant of a survival technique every farm in the South and the hills knew by heart. Number 6. Butter under brine. Fresh butter goes rancid fast in a warm kitchen. But a churning family often had more butter in summer than it could possibly eat, so they had to make it last. Your grandmother worked extra salt into the fresh butter, which slowed spoilage, then packed it down hard into a crock, pressing out every air pocket. Over the top, she poured a layer of cold saltwater brine that sealed the butter away from the air completely. Kept down in the cold cellar or the spring house, salted butter put up this way stayed good for months, ready for winter, baking long after the cow had dried up and the churn had gone quiet. Some families pressed the butter into wooden molds carved with a thistle or a cow or a sheaf of wheat, so even the humblest crock of preserved butter came to the table looking like something special. It was a small touch of pride on top of plain hard work. Number 5. Waxed hard cheese. A dairy family with a surplus of milk faced a use it or lose it problem every single day. And the grand solution was cheese, because a wheel of hard cheese turned perishable milk into food that lasted for a year. After pressing the curds into a firm wheel, your great-grandmother coated the whole thing in a shell of wax or sealed it in a tight cloth rubbed with lard, locking out the air and the mold. Then the wheel went into the cool cellar to age, and time did the rest, the flavor deepening and sharpening month after month. A single wheel concentrated gallons of milk into a dense, keepable food that could be shaved over beans, melted into bread, or eaten in a wedge with an apple. Aging cheese was patience turned into pantry insurance. The wheel you started in June was your sharp, crumbly reward come the following spring, and not one drop of that summer's milk had gone to waste. Number 4. Jerky and dried beef. The oldest meat preservation in the book needed no fire, no salt barrel, and no cellar, just AIR and sun. Your grandparents cut beef or venison into thin strips, salted it, and hung it to dry in the sun or near the stove until every bit of moisture was gone and the meat turned dark and hard as wood. With the water driven out, there was nothing left for spoilage to live on, and properly made jerky kept for months without any cold storage at all. A pioneer could carry a pouch of it across 1,000 miles. A farm family kept it for the lean times when fresh meat ran out. The technique came down from the native peoples who had perfected it over centuries, and it spread to every frontier kitchen in the country. Chewed slow, a single strip carried a working man through a long day in the field. It was protein you could put in your pocket and forget about until you needed it. Number 3. Canning in mason jars. Here is the revolution that changed everything. In 1858, a tinsmith named John Mason patented a glass jar with a screw-on lid and a rubber seal, and it put real preservation into the hands of every household in America. Your grandmother packed fresh tomatoes, beans, peaches, and whole meals into those jars, set the lids on loose, and boiled them in a big water bath canner. The heat killed everything inside and drove out the air, and as the jars cooled, the lid sucked down and sealed with that satisfying little pop, locking the food away safe on the shelf for a year or more with no refrigeration whatsoever. A pantry lined floor to ceiling with home-canned jars was a farm wife's pride and her family's insurance policy against a hungry winter. Pressure canning later made it safe to put up low-acid foods and meats too. Whole industries grew up promising to do this for you in a can, but a shelf of your grandmother's mason jars held the brightest taste of summer straight through the snow. Number 2. Salt pork in the barrel. If one single method kept the American working family alive more than any other, it was salt. Salt was preservation itself. At hog butchering time in the fall, your great-grandparents packed slabs of pork fat and belly into a wooden barrel between thick layers of coarse salt, sometimes drowning it in a heavy brine on top. The salt pulled every bit of water out of the meat and made it a place where spoilage simply could not survive. And down in the cellar, That barrel of salt pork kept for months, even a full year. A chunk hacked off the barrel and fried up gave the fat and the deep, cured flavor that seasoned a whole pot of beans, greens, or potatoes. For families who could rarely afford fresh meat, a hunk of salt pork was the difference between a flavorless pot and a meal that stuck to your ribs. That single barrel in the corner of the cellar was the quiet engine that ran the poor man's kitchen all winter long. Number 1. The root cellar. At the very top of the list is not a recipe or a trick, but a place, the one that made nearly everything else possible. The root cellar was a room dug into the side of a hill or down beneath the house, with thick earthen or stone walls that held a steady, cold, damp temperature just above freezing all year round, summer and winter alike. The ground itself did the work. Into that dark, cool room went the entire harvest. Bins of potatoes and apples, barrels of salt pork and corned beef, crocks of butter and sauerkraut and pickles, shelves lined floor to ceiling with hundreds of mason jars, braids of onions hanging from the beams. A well-stocked root cellar in October held everything a family needed to eat well clear through to the next growing season, with no electricity, no machinery, and no monthly bill. It was the beating heart of a self-reliant household, the single most important room on the place. When the supermarket and the refrigerator arrived, the root cellar was the first thing we filled in and forgot. And of everything on this list, it may be the thing we lost that mattered most. Here is my challenge. Pick one of these and try it this week. Just one. String up some leather breeches, start a crock of sauerkraut, wrap a few apples in newspaper, and tuck them somewhere cool. Then come back and tell me whether your grandparents were just making do or whether they knew something we have been too comfortable to remember. Drop the one you are going to try in the comments. I want to know if the root cellar gets more love than the smokehouse, because these were never just old chores. They were a whole way of feeding a family that we traded away, and it might be worth remembering before we need it again.